It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. James Eglinton, who is the Meldrum Senior Lecturer in Theology in the University of Edinburgh, New College. He's also a member and a minister of the Free Church of Scotland, and he's a very active Christian in the University of Edinburgh, and those of us who live in Edinburgh really appreciate all that he is doing. So I'm delighted to invite him to come to speak to us now. James, come up. I should also add that his son and my grandson are in the same class in high school.
And have been best friends since what you would call kindergarten as well. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. For this lecture, I have been asked to speak about the church and society. Now, both of those words, church on the one hand, society on the other, are extremely broad, which is a very useful thing for an invited speaker because it creates a lot of scope to take something very broad and narrow it into something very specific. Or in this case, two very broad words, where you could narrow each into some specific angle on society and specific angle on church. But I'm not going to do that tonight. Instead, I'm deliberately keeping society in particular as broad as I possibly can. Thinking about it with as much latitude as I can in order to use the word society to address the shared life of people, the shared life of large communities of people, where society functions as an expression of human life together, where it arises from the sociality of human life. So I'm using the term society in this lecture in a way that can absorb terms like culture and civilization. And I'm doing that very deliberately, and that'll become very obvious as the lecture goes on. And I'm keeping things as broad as I can with the word society, because in this lecture I want to address an urgent need of the church today, a need that becomes very apparent when we are being as broad as we can with the word society, and trying to set it against a broad, big picture, macro-historical backdrop. So if I could tweak my title at the beginning from church and society, I would make it something like the church and the challenge of today's Western society. Now, I'm aware, of course, that not everyone here is from the West, but as I hope will be clear in the lecture, the plight of the church in the West is also directly relevant to the church outside the West. Western culture at the moment talks a lot about its efforts to undo the global spread of Western culture in an older form of the Western colonial era, what often gets called decolonization. I'm fairly skeptical about a lot of what goes on under because I'm convinced that Western people today have really outgrown that older mindset. Very often we still expect the non-Western world to whatever our newest ideas are and to come into line with norms and values. The West continues to expect culture, and Western culture remains extremely to the church outside the West as well. So I hope that if you're not Western, it'll be useful to you. So what is this novel challenge that I'm trying to address in this lecture in Western society? In our day and age, I think that the church in the West finds itself in a historically novel situation with regard to the kind of wider society in which the church exists. And the novel thing is that this host society that the church lives in is marked by a chaotic love-hate relationship towards Christianity. Okay? A chaotic love-hate relationship. Now, it will be no news to anyone here if you have any experience of Western people, or if you are a Western person, it will be no news to you that Western culture is in a state of chaos and flux. Living in Western culture, unless you spend all day with your eyes closed and your fingers in your ears, Western culture is an exhausting thing to inhabit because of this constant state of flux. And in the midst of all of that, we find an attempted and awkward process of redefining Western society's relationship to Christianity. In many ways, it's simply not easy to be a Christian, at least to be a theologically orthodox Christian, in my experience, in many Western countries. When I think of my children going through Scottish state schooling, it's much more difficult for them to be Christians than it was for me in the same school system in the 1980s and 90s on a daily level, in terms of how, again, chaotic and confusing Scottish society's attitudes are to a range of different Christian beliefs and practices. Now, it might be tempting to say, simplistically, that Western society has just become entirely post-Christian, and we're back in the days of the early church, persecution, outsider status, martyrdom in a pagan society. I think that kind of back to square one approach as a way of understanding our current historical moment is inaccurate. I think we need a better account of the moment that we're in. As I said a moment ago, whatever this process that Western society is in, of redefining its relationship to Christianity, it has not succeeded in utterly overturning Christianity's every formative influence on Western society. Instead, Western society has become something different, and in the broadest terms, I think it now has a love-hate posture towards Christianity. Even the most avowedly atheist Christian Westerner is profoundly indebted to Christianity, and it takes a lot of either cognitive dissonance or just willful blindness to historical facts to deny that. Western culture today is still inexplicable without Christianity, to the point that rather than seeing contemporary Western society as some kind of wholesale reversion to the old pagan days before Christianity, it's far more accurate to say that the society that Western people have produced is really a kind of Christian cultural heresy that we live in, where you can only account for it in terms of Christianity and its influences, but something has gone drastically wrong. Now, trying to understand that and all that it entails, and the society that the church is now in the West, is complex. And I'm far from the first person to try to do so. A century ago, a German cultural observer and historian called Oswald Spengler wrote a fascinating book that came out in English under the title The Decline of the West. Now, that's not a good translation of the German book title that he wrote it under, which was Der Untergang des Abendlandes. Now, Untergang, going down, going under, is the word that you use to talk about the setting of the sun. So that's the first part of his title, the setting, the going down. And the word that he used to describe the West isn't just the West. Instead, it's the Abendland, the evening land. Okay? So the book title that he chose is about an evening land, about a society whose sun is setting. And then you start to get to why it was really difficult for the translator to work out, how do you say Der Untergang des Abendlandes in English? So they just went for The Decline of the West. And it's not a great title, but the original title is very significant. Now, his work was very influential a century ago. Since then, he's fallen into obscurity. But in his book, he provides a way of accounting for the history of the world as a history of civilizations as they rise and fall. And he thought that across world history, these civilizations each have a lifespan of around 2,000 years, where in the first 1,000 years, a civilization grows up and it flourishes, and then for the second 1,000 years, it declines, and then eventually it dies out. Its sun inevitably sets. But within this 2,000-year window, he thought that across world history, you could see three distinct phases that help you understand societies as they emerge and as they also disappear. In the first of these phases, he thought, you find the creation of a culture, okay? So culture is phase one, where whatever had come before and existed before, this old order of things, was gradually overturned in its beliefs, in its norms, in its values, and a new way of believing and existing and imagining and living is imagined into being. And with that, that's the attempt to create culture. So this first phase is like the rising of a new sun. First, as a crack of light on a distant horizon, and then where that light increases and increases, and it casts longer shadows until the day gets hotter and hotter, and eventually this new culture is being created, and eventually it has creatively expanded enough for a second phase to begin. So by this point, the sun is approaching midday, and its heat is felt most intensely. And a second phase begins, which is civilization. So culture comes first, then comes civilization. On the basis of all the earlier attempts to create a new culture, the people who then come next spend a very long time imagining and inhabiting the world on the basis of what had just been created. They now swim exclusively in those waters. By the time a civilization has occurred, the worldview that animates it has become the only show in town. But in Spengler's history, no civilization lasts forever. Eventually, its sun has to set. And he believed that this was the common pattern in the rise and the fall of ancient civilizations in other parts of the world. And he also said that it was the same of Western culture and Christianity, hence the decline of the West, or the twilight of the evening land. Now, in that book, he advanced a provocative thesis, which is the idea that Western, which for him means Christian, society has already passed through the first two phases. It has passed through the culture creation phase. It has now passed through the civilization phase. And so for a very long period, the civilization phase was a settled Christian civilization that people inhabited and that people had been formed by for a millennium. But in the 20th century, and he was writing at the beginning of the 20th century, he believed that Western Christian civilization had now entered its terminal phase. It is dying out. And the long process of Christianization was unraveling, and it was going to be replaced soon with something different. That the process was going to begin again with the attempt to create a new culture. And this would not be organized around Christianity. Instead, he said it would be organized around the pursuit of brute power. So he said that Christianity would be replaced by what he called Caesarism. He predicted the rise of the age of strongmen political leaders whose influence would be, an example would be copied at every level of society. And the world will give up on, he said that liberal democracy was about to die in the 20th century because it was a product of Christianity, and instead there would be a totalitarian culture that will come instead. And in some of those observations, he was maybe not far from wrong. But as I said, his work has largely fallen into obscurity, and also he was not without critics. From a Reformed perspective, for example, his analysis was typical of this early 20th century belief in the secularization hypothesis, that Christianity would inevitably die out in the 20th century, which is its own form of unbelief in the gospel. And like many in his time, he also did not foresee the astonishing global spread of Christianity in the non-Western world that would happen over the 20th century. So there's a lot that's wrong in his work, but his analysis of the shape of de-Christianization and also what the earlier effect of Christianization meant is really instructive for those of us today in the West who want to try and understand the society that we live in and some of the changes that have happened in Western society. So he reminds us, for example, that for well over a millennium, Western people had inhabited a society that was itself the product of Christianity, a society that served a formative function that prepared them for formal interaction with the gospel. For century after century after century, to inhabit Western society was to undergo a kind of catechesis, a constant catechesis for the imagination that shaped Western people in a way that fundamentally aided their receptivity to the gospel. Christianity had first entered their pagan cultures like a drop of water thrown into a river, but eventually Christianity had grown to the point that it coursed through the river until it became the water itself in which they swam. It provided them with this basic attunement to the self, to their own bodies, to the world, to God, that was holistic in ways that are really difficult for 21st century Western people even to imagine what that would have been like. So until recently, Western society readied its inhabitants to encounter, express articulation of the Christian faith. So for all of its limitations, Spengler's work is extremely helpful in remembering that humans are always formed and catechized by their social settings, and that something drastic has changed in the nature of that, and that Western Christian social catechesis became very different, or something happened to it in the 19th and 20th centuries. And it's really helpful in giving us a better informed picture, for example, of what it was like to be a nominal Christian in the medieval or early modern world. You know, evangelicals today often project the kind of modern day unbelief that you might find in your next door neighbor back onto these nominal Christians who inhabited the Western world for century after century. And we imagine that the average nominal Christian from that period was not really any different to your unbelieving next door neighbor today. Someone who's not receptive to the gospel, who never darkens the door of a church, and so on. But in reality, the nominal Christian in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries in the West might only have been expected to attend church once a year. But that person did so having been formed in a society, in a cultural consensus that prepared him for that explicit articulation of the Christian faith. A medieval nominal Christian did not attend church and think, wait a minute, this is offensive. This is the opposite to what society has told me is the good and the true and the beautiful. Rather, that nominal Christian would attend church and find that the way that he had been formed by society suddenly made more sense rather than less. So the medieval nominal Christian, or the early modern nominal Christian, is not like your unbelieving neighbor next door today. In the West, at least, nominal Christians are increasingly a very rare breed, certainly in Western Europe, increasingly so in America as well. So they're not really, these nominal Christians from the past are not really comparable to anyone on your street. So that's a really important lesson with the argument that I'm going to try and develop in the rest of the lecture. Now, at this point, though, I want to shift from Spengler, who's useful but limited, to one of his contemporaries, who I think is much more useful. And that is the Dutch neo-Calvinist theologian, Abraham Kuiper, so at one point also the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Like Spengler, Kuiper was extremely gifted as a macro history, big picture kind of thinker. But unlike Spengler, Kuiper was an Orthodox Christian, and he had considerably more faith in the Catholicity of Christianity, which is to say, as we heard from Michael Allen this morning, its ability to take root in any culture, in any phase in history. So Kuiper had no fears that somehow the gospel will reach people that it can't transform. So Kuiper believed a lot more in the power of the gospel, for which reason Kuiper didn't think that Christianity was now in its death throes in the West. But despite that, Kuiper made many observations in his work, in his later years, that is very similar to Oswald Spengler. So here I'm thinking about Kuiper's work pro rege. So Kuiper also saw that something drastic had changed in Western society, and he saw that the church now faced considerable and novel challenges in Western society. Now, I introduced Spengler's work by explaining what the original title means and why Decline of the West doesn't really capture it. So I suppose I should do the same for Kuiper's book, the book I'm talking about, Pro Rege. That's Latin for the king. So Kuiper wrote this book in the 1910s, and the context for the book is that he'd served one term as prime minister between 1901 and 1905, and then had lost his seat to a liberal politician, and he then taken an extended trip around the Mediterranean and immersed himself in Islamic society there to give himself a different kind of vantage point to consider the West and Western society. And the penny really dropped for Kuiper in this phase of life that Christians in Western Europe, at least, were now living under the lordship of Christ in a society that did not. So this book, Pro Rege, for the king, as addressing that issue. What does it mean to have Christ as your king if you live in a society that is trying to dethrone Christ? Or that bows one knee to Christ and defies him with the other knee. I'm not even sure if that metaphor works, but that has this love-hate relationship to Christ the King. I don't think Kuiper and Spengler ever met, but if they had, I think they could have a really long, fruitful conversation with a lot of points of agreement. In Pro Rege, Kuiper also charts the sudden extinction of nominal Western Christians as part of a profound change in Western society. But Kuiper was far more concerned with the question of what the church should do in that context. In Pro Rege, Kuiper drew on a biblical image from the Old Testament. That's the thing I'm really asking you to focus on and take away from this. And the biblical image is the image of the temple in the Old Testament having both a forecourt and a holy place. And the holy place, Kuiper said, illustrates the church in this analogy. The holy place is the church throughout the history of the West. It's a place of worship, a place of religion that is active and intentional, where participation really costs a lot. It's high buy-in, and it means significant personal commitment. Okay, that's the holy place in the temple. But the holy place is surrounded by a forecourt, and the temple forecourt, by contrast, is a place where people mill around in the glow of what happens in the holy place, influenced by it, formed by it, but people mill around there, and it's the surrounding social space. So the temple forecourt in Kuiper's history is the social space that surrounds the church. It is Western society across its history, the history of Christianization. Now, Kuiper's macro history of the West doesn't follow Spengler in the 2,000-year lifespan after which things inevitably fall apart, but he was strikingly similar to Spengler in perceiving the formative role of society in affecting how the people in that society will respond to a direct, explicit encounter with Christianity. Kuiper's temple forecourt is the society of nominal Christians, mostly nominal Christians, that Spengler described, that you have when the sun is at its zenith, so to speak. Now, in Kuiper's account, that temple forecourt began as a tiny, tiny place in the pagan Greco-Roman world, but gradually it increased and expanded until it became synonymous with Western society itself. In Kuiper's account, those who'd milled around in that forecourt in Western society for centuries were largely nominal Christians, to be sure. But nonetheless, they lived in the glow of the worshiping life of the church, and that's not insignificant. In Kuiper's book, a nominal medieval Christian might only have attended church once a year, but that encounter was an affirmation of that person's general formation in cultural Christendom. So that occasional encounter with a clear articulation of the Christian faith was not a jarring experience in relation to that person's way of imagining the world for the rest of the year. Rather, participation in the worshiping life of the church brought that person's mentality about self, world, God, into much greater clarity. Even an occasional encounter had striking affective power because it was met with so little culturally ingrained resistance. But writing in 1910, Kuiper thought something huge has changed in the West. The early 20th century Western church, and he's very focused on his Dutch context, but the Western church could no longer safely assume that Western people swam in predominantly Christian waters. So in Pro Rege, Kuiper writes about it almost like a geologist who is looking at different layers of soil that have been laid down one on top of the other. In Dutch society in 1910, he thought that you could see these different layers in 3 different generations, and the grandparents of 1910, the parents, and their children. And you could see these layers all at the same time. So for the Dutch grandparents of 1910, Kuiper thought that they were the last generation of truly nominal Christians, truly nominal Dutch Christians. They were the least culturally resistant to Christianity, and they had some active knowledge of the content of Christianity, so not just what its rituals look and sound like, So not just that you say a formulaic prayer at dinner, but that you know something about what prayer actually is. So they have some knowledge of the substance, but they, for the most part, had not been existentially impacted enough by Christianity to pass on substance. So instead, the grandparents pass on to their children just the outward rituals, a familiarity with the aesthetics. So these grandparents had passed on a handful of formulaic prayers to their children, so formulaic dinner-time grace. But the children, so the parents' generation here, okay, the grandparents, the parents, so the parents never knew whether the grandparents ever prayed outside of a formulaic grace at dinner. They just didn't know. But to the grandparents' generation, it would be, you always say grace at dinner. And it would be unimaginable, to think that one day your funeral wouldn't be a Christian funeral, for example, or that your wedding wouldn't happen in a church. So you have the grandparents, you have the parents. So the parents of 1910 retained awareness of the aesthetic rituals of Christianity. Someone said grace, they knew that that was a thing. And they showed some deference to those rituals when they were in this. So Kuiper's analysis was really insightful. So they showed some deference to those rituals when they're in the same social space as the grandparents. So if grandma and grandpa, if Oma and Opa come for dinner, we will say grace. If they're not there, we won't, though. We just don't even think about it. Okay? So they have some kind of deference to the rituals, and they draw that out sometimes when they need to, but they see no need to pass on any of that, even the aesthetics, to their own children. So for the most part, the parents of 1910, this middle there, receive a pretty thin, meager inheritance of what they think Christianity is, and they actively pass on almost none of that to their children, to the next generation. So when Kuiper described the Dutch children of 1910, he wrote of them as already effectively estranged from Christianity. It was not a given for the children that when I grow up and get married, it must happen in a church, or my children will definitely be baptized, of course, or that Christianity is a given in any of those things. But in real terms, he thought these children now are mostly biblically illiterate, and they're both being formed by, and they are forming, a society that didn't treat Christianity as the society's necessary complement. Now, Kuiper's description of this novel society then that has sprung up with this third generation, with these children, and the reason that generation struggles with Christianity is also really fascinating and complex. So Por Ege you can't read it in an afternoon. It's a very big book. So he thought that these late modern people had problems with money that affected their struggle with Christianity. They'd abstractified money. They turned it into something completely intangible and in ways. So pre-modern people thought about wealth as powerful, but also as finite. If you measure your wealth in how many cows you have, you can be very wealthy one day, but if there's a plague of huge hailstones and your cows all die, then tomorrow you'll be really poor. Modern people have turned money into something that they never see and touch, and that can feel so infinite, and that makes them feel like gods, because with money you can make things happen. So money is a big problem for modern people. The same is true of modern Western people having mastered the natural world through science and technology. He said all these things make it hard for modern people to feel that they need God. Also, you have the kind of atheism of Friedrich Nietzsche springing up in the early 20th century, which was truly novel, with Nietzsche as a consistent atheist who saw Jesus as the source of all that is wrong with Western society, and who called for a social revolution in which any norms that stem from Jesus should be sought out and overturned. So Kuiper saw that the Christian content of Western cultural waters or social waters had now become very dilute. It formed people for whom the Christian gospel defied and offended important parts of how they imagined the world, rather than very holistically affirming and completing how they imagined the world, as was the experience of the average medieval or early modern Western person. And for Kuiper, the temple forecourt had shrunk dramatically. It was much, much smaller than it had been in previous centuries. But the temple forecourt could shrink, and it could even disappear. But here Kuiper is very different to Spengler. for Kuiper, the holy place still remains. So even if the temple forecourt is gone, the prospect of the extinction of nominal Christians for Kuiper did not mean the extinction of committed, intentional Christians. And in fact, Kuiper thought that this change in society meant that the committed Christians would be stronger than ever, smaller in number, but much more rigorous and intentional in their commitment to the faith. Now, a moment or two ago, I used the word dilute. So Kuiper saw that the waters of Western society, Christian waters, were now much more dilute. So Kuiper did not think that Christianity had simply been overturned, as though Western Christianity had just died overnight. It was here yesterday, today it is utterly gone, and a new culture has just emerged out of nothing. Instead, he thought that Western people now swam in very mixed waters, where the average Westerner was being catechized both by a deep cultural memory of Jesus and a much more recent jolt from Nietzsche. The same Westerner would now be likely to draw on turn the other cheek, but also what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and do that all in the same breath, without really knowing that Jesus said one and that Nietzsche said the other, and that the whole ways of thinking that those two phrases encapsulate are fundamentally irreconcilable. Part of the usefulness of Kuiper and his analysis is that he doesn't just bemoan social phenomena like these teenagers don't know anything about the Bible, so we just have to teach them the Bible as though lack of education will solve everything. And then all of a sudden they will receive the gospel differently. Rather, as was typical of theologians in their neo-Calvinist movements, Bavinck and Kuiper and so on, Kuiper grasped that all human life is a process of faith-seeking understanding, and there is no human knowledge that does not begin with faith in one thing or another. So Kuiper knew that for previous generations of Westerners, the life of faith-seeking understanding was much more harmonious in how they were formed in the temple forecourt, so to speak, of society, and then how they experienced the holy place, going to church. But now this had changed dramatically because the temple forecourt had receded almost to nothing, and it had been replaced by a very different social environment. And here's the real significance of Kuiper's insight for us. That social environment that has replaced the old temple forecourt will ground those that it forms in a faith that simultaneously depends on and despises Christianity. So that's the love-hate relationship I was talking about at the beginning. And then formation in that environment makes the gospel an extremely confusing message to hear for the first time, because the gospel exposes a rift that runs through the uniquely disordered late modern Western soul. Now, a second ago I used the examples of a phrase from Jesus and a phrase from Nietzsche. Turn the other cheek, and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Someone who is formed in Western society today, and also back in Kuiper's day, will probably find something deeply resonant and beautiful and true about turn the other cheek. Okay? If you make them think about it, well, there's something that's important in the power of forgiveness. There's something that's futile about repaying violence with violence, because that will just go on forever. Or if you put it in another way, if you present secularized Western people today with the choice either to be, and they have to choose one of the two, to be someone who inflicts suffering on another person, or to be the one who receives suffering, and you have to choose. Most Western people today will still say, I would choose to receive suffering. I would rather not be the one who is causing someone else to suffer. And that doesn't come from nowhere. That comes from Jesus. That comes from turn the other cheek. It comes from the teaching of Scripture. And even if people don't know it, that belief comes from Christianity. And when they encounter Christianity for the first time, there is much in it that will make more sense of how they think and how they intuit the world. But for the same person, there's also something that's very resonant in the deeply anti-Christian philosophy of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, which is a summary of Nietzsche's ideas on, actually, he would choose the opposite explicitly. If you had to choose, you don't want to be the weak one. You don't want to be dominated. You dominate. You would choose to inflict suffering. And that's all part of the package of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So the Western soul has become a chaotically disordered thing. That's why I said at the beginning that it's really a kind of Christian cultural heresy. The temple forecourt is entirely gone in much of the West, and it's been replaced by this confusing, syncretistic, formative environment. And when people who are formed by that society hear the gospel, they will love it and they will hate it at the same time. You take another example, like many, although not all, secularized Westerners today will hear a good thing and a true thing and a beautiful thing when they hear the voice of Christianity saying that sex should be consensual rather than coercive. But the same people will then be utterly repelled when they hear that the voice of Christianity has much more to say on sex than simply consensus alone and there's no further ethic. In The Lord of the Rings, there's this one ring to rule them all, okay? And that one ring to rule them all symbolizes the corrupting evil that is absolute power in the hands of an unworthy person. And in the Lord of the Rings, that ring simultaneously has both an attractive and a repellent quality. Okay? Think of someone like Gollum, who both loves and hates the ring. You can see the same clash of attraction and revulsion in Bilbo Baggins, in Boromir, and Lady Galadriel. Those who come close to the ring can't help but think, this is good for me, and this is bad for me at the same time. But those who are wise know, of course, that they have to see beyond that, and they have to think that the right course of action is resist the love-hate pool, keep yourself distant from the ring until you can get it to Mount Doom, where you destroy it forever in fire. In Lord of the Rings, that's how the power of evil, or flip it around, the evil of power is depicted. But I think we can borrow that image to try and understand how a lot of secularized Western people today think of Christianity. At the same time, it feels, if you hear it for the first time and you're produced by the society, it feels good for you, but it also feels really bad for you. It attracts you and it repels you at the same time. And if you're a truly wise person, it's probably best not to put the ring on. And it would be really good for our society to take it to Mount Doom and get rid of it forever that way. That's how you resolve the conflict that the gospel exposes in the Western soul. Now, Kuiper's analysis of Western society is tremendously insightful in that regard. But the implication that this book, Pro Rege, creates is also challenging to the church in the West today, because there's something that's implicit in his analysis of this change, the disappearance of the temple forecourt, and all that that means, and how hard it is for Western people to be receptive to the gospel and for the church to reach them. So implicit in that whole analysis is the need for the church in the West today to make a new temple forecourt, okay? And not to rely on society to be that for us anymore. And if we stay with the image of swimming in waters, which I've just taken from Kuiper, so I didn't have to make that one up. He didn't do Lord of the Rings, but he has a lot of stuff about swimming in waters and rivers to explain this. He describes how in a bygone age, the waters of Western society, these Christianized waters, created a space in which nominal Christians could allow themselves to be carried along by its Christian current, when they themselves were tremendously weak swimmers. And they could be carried along by the current of the gospel, or you could state it differently, they lived within a catechetical environment that attuned all of their intuitions about the things that matter most, about themselves, the world, their creator, their redeemer. And it catechized them even when they were weak and very passive within that, until they were carried into an environment that would challenge them to start swimming and to swim actively and to get stronger in swimming. So it gave them a space to belong en route to a very firm challenge to believe. Western society had a current like that simply made it easier for them to move with the waters while they were not good at swimming. And it made them much less likely to drown in the deep waters of explicit engagement with the church. In 1910, Kuiper thought that had now changed in the Netherlands. And I think he was probably half a century describing things that were happening there half a century before they happened in Scotland. I think in Scotland, we are decades ahead of where you are in America, but this pattern seems to be the same. So now he thought the thing that unbelievers need is a different kind of society, a temple forecourt where they can mill around in the glow of the holy place and where Christianity can reattune their imagination and it can create space for them to belong nominally as a stage to then believing actively. Now, in his own day, Kuiper provided a lot of rich social analysis, but a lot less in terms of concrete application. What might that new temple forecourt look like for the Western Church today? In British culture, at least, so I can speak about where I'm from, a book like Dominion by Tom Holland has created a very useful literary part of the forecourt. It is a book that argues very persuasively that Western culture was transformed by what he calls the Christian Revolution, and he shows Western people today who might think, I'm very secular and I'm very progressive, and I was not formed by anything that came before, and certainly not Christianity. And he shows them that actually, do you believe in universal human rights? Do you believe in the dignity of every human being? Do you believe in love? And shows that all these things are the product of Christianity reshaping the West. And a book like that has created a kind of temple forecourt, a literary forecourt, where in British culture, a lot of people have regained a sense of being culturally Christian, but without an accompanying clear sense of the importance of personal, ecclesially grounded faith in Christ. So there are ways that some kind of forecourt is being constructed. But if we are thinking about the church, churches that have both an intentionally constructed forecourt and a rich holy place, and in personal terms, very high commitment holy place, churches like that, I think, are still quite few and far between. I could put it in very ordinary terms, that if you are an average Reformed Christian today, finding ways to connect your non-Christian friends and your church is probably really, really difficult. Now, I think and I'll close with this, that the development of that combination of holy place and forecourt, where the forecourt is truly preparatory for direct engagement with the church, is really hard. And maybe some of you are much further ahead in your thinking about what it looks like than I am. If so, I'd be really glad to hear from you. But I know that it must be built. I agree with Kuiper, with his implication on that very firmly. Thank you for your attention.